There's a strange stillness that lives in those who have awakened. You can see it in their eyes, that quiet recognition that the world they once knew no longer fits. While everyone else rushes through life, chasing illusions, they stand in the middle of the storm, motionless, watching, not because they don't feel pain, but because they've begun to understand it. Alan Watts once said that awakening is not about escaping the human experience, but about seeing through it. And that is precisely where the silent suffering begins. To awaken is to die before you die. It's to witness the collapse of everything you believed was real. Your identity, your attachments, your ambitions. The walls of your inner world crumble. And for the first time, you realize there is no you inside the castle. Only awareness, watching. It is a beautiful revelation, but also a lonely one. How can you explain to those still asleep that the self they defend so fiercely is a dream they never truly had? The awakened suffer not because they are lost, but because they can no longer belong. They see the comedy and tragedy of existence playing on repeat, and yet they cannot laugh nor cry the same way again. They feel everything, every vibration of joy and sorrow, yet nothing clings to them anymore. It is a paradox that few understand. The deeper the realization, the quieter the soul becomes. And in that silence, there is both peace and profound isolation. But Alan Watts would remind us, this silence is not punishment. It is purification. The suffering of the awakened is the fire that burns away illusion, leaving only what is real. The pain is not a sign of failure, but of transition, the soul stretching beyond the limits of personality into something vast and eternal. The silence they endure is not empty. It's the sound of truth expanding inside them. So when the awakened suffer in silence, it is not because they are broken. It's because they have seen too much to speak in the language of the sleeping. They suffer not from despair, but from the tenderness of knowing. For once you glimpse eternity through the cracks of your own heart, every word becomes too small, and silence, at last, feels like the only thing sacred enough to hold the truth. There comes a point in every awakening when the silence becomes unbearable, not because it is empty, but because it is too full. It holds every sound, every thought, every heartbeat of existence. Alan Watts often spoke of this moment, the confrontation with the void that is not a void at all, but the essence of being. The awakened one realizes that the noise of the world was never outside. It was inside, created by the endless chatter of the mind. When that chatter begins to fade, what remains is a silence so vast it can swallow your sense of self whole. And that is where the suffering begins, not from pain, but from the disintegration of everything you once called you. The mind resists this dissolution. It wants something solid to hold on to, a belief, a story, a name. But awakening strips all that away. It doesn't give you something new to believe in. It takes away the comfort of believing altogether. You begin to see how every identity you've worn, student, lover, child, teacher, was only a mask. Beneath them all, there was only awareness, untouched and eternal. Yet, knowing this intellectually is one thing. Living it is another. Living without identity is like walking without ground. Every step is uncertain. Every breath a surrender. Alan Watts used to compare this to the dance of life. He said the point of dancing isn't to reach the end of the floor, it's to dance. But the awakened forget how to dance for a while. They have seen behind the curtain, and now every movement feels staged, every role rehearsed. They watch others chase ambitions, fall in love, argue, dream, and they envy the simplicity of it, not because they wish to return to ignorance, but because innocence feels like a distant planet they can no longer touch. It's the ache of knowing too much. And yet, in that ache, something begins to shift. The awakened start to see beauty even in the suffering. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes a sacred companion. They notice the rhythm of the wind, the patience of a tree, the quiet grace in a stranger's eyes. The separation between me and the world starts to dissolve. It's no longer, I am looking at the sunset, but the sunset is happening in me. This shift, from observer to being, is where true peace begins to flicker, faint but undeniable. But before peace, there is surrender. The awakened must surrender not only to silence, but to the truth that life doesn't owe them clarity. There is no finish line, no enlightenment to achieve. Watts warned that the greatest illusion is the idea that there is something to reach. The awakened suffer until they realize that awakening was never a destination, but a return to what has always been. And that realization, when it lands, doesn't erase the suffering. It simply makes it sacred. When you awaken, the world does not change. Your perception does. That is perhaps the hardest truth to accept. Alan Watts often described awakening as seeing through the game, not quitting it. You still play, but now you know it's a play. The problem is that others don't know that you know, and this creates an invisible distance between you and the rest of humanity. You laugh, but differently. You love, but more quietly. You participate, but without belief. The awakened become actors aware of their roles, watching the stage burn while smiling at the beauty of the fire. This awareness is both a blessing and a burden. It dissolves fear, but replaces it with a deep melancholy. The melancholy of realizing that life is both profoundly meaningful and utterly meaningless at once. Watts called it the divine paradox. You see that every joy carries sorrow within it, and every loss hides liberation. You no longer cling to pleasure, yet you no longer reject pain. Everything becomes part of the same mysterious pulse. And while this understanding brings peace, it also isolates. You speak a language few can understand, not because it's complex, but because it requires silence to hear. The awakened often appear detached, but it's not detachment from life. It's detachment from illusion. They no longer take offense easily, because there's no self left to be offended. They forgive without effort, not because they are saints, but because they see that everyone is acting out a dream they didn't choose. Watts said, "You are the universe pretending to be a person." When this truth settles in, anger dissolves, pride fades, and the old hunger for recognition dies quietly. In its place grows a strange tenderness, not sentimental, but deeply compassionate. However, this compassion is not loud. The awakened rarely preach, because they understand that awakening cannot be forced upon anyone. Just as you cannot make a flower bloom by pulling its petals open, you cannot awaken a soul by shouting truth at it. The awakened suffer in silence, because they respect the rhythm of every being's unfolding. They know that even pain is a form of grace, the universe's way of chiseling us into awareness. And so, they watch, they wait, and they love quietly from the background. In time, the suffering softens. It doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes a quiet fire that warms rather than burns. The awakened realize that silence was never emptiness. It was the voice of the universe whispering through them. In that realization, the suffering loses its sting. They no longer seek to escape it. Instead, they allow it to be what it is, another ripple in the infinite ocean of being. And, as Alan Watts would say, when you stop resisting the waves, you discover you were never drowning. You were only learning how to float. To live after awakening is to walk the edge between worlds, one foot in the illusion, one in the infinite. Alan Watts described it as learning to swim in the flow of existence without trying to reach the shore. You are still human, still bound by hunger, love, and fear, yet you no longer take these as ultimate truths. They become waves upon the surface of consciousness, rising, falling, and disappearing. But the difficulty lies in remembering that you are not the wave. When old emotions return, when loneliness bites, the awakened one still feels them deeply. The difference is that now they know, they are watching the storm from within the sea. At first, this awareness feels like a curse. You can no longer hide from your own thoughts, no longer believe the lies that once comforted you. Every desire reveals its root, every fear its illusion. Watts used to say that awakening is a bit of a cosmic joke, because the seeker eventually realizes there was never anything to seek. Yet, knowing that doesn't erase the longing to belong. The awakened still crave connection, still wish to be understood, but now the space between souls feels wider. They look into others' eyes and see themselves reflected, the same consciousness playing different roles. and that realization both soothes and stings. The suffering in silence comes from the impossibility of return. You can't unsee truth. You can't unknow what you become aware of. The ego tries to rebuild, to reattach to something solid, but every attempt crumbles under the light of awareness. There's no longer a you to protect, only the game itself unfolding. And so, the awakened continue living, but now as participants who are also witnesses. They do not take sides in the drama. They see the beauty of both the hero and the villain. For both are expressions of the same divine energy pretending to be separate. Yet even in this knowing, pain remains, but becomes transparent. The awakened learn to sit with it, to breathe through it, to let it speak. They begin to see pain not as an obstacle, but as a messenger. Every sorrow whispers the same truth. You are still trying to hold on. And when they finally stop resisting, the pain transforms. It becomes a rhythm, a teacher, a silent guide back to presence. What's often reminded that what we resist persists, and that liberation isn't about escaping suffering, but understanding it so deeply that it loses its power. And that understanding changes everything. The awakened no longer ask, "Why am I suffering?" but rather, "Who is suffering?" In that question, identity dissolves again. The silence deepens. And though they may still walk through darkness, they now carry a quiet light, the kind that doesn't shine to be seen, but simply exists, unshaken, eternal. Alan Watts used to say that most people confuse being serious with being sincere. The awakened understand this difference intimately. Before awakening, they took life seriously, every problem, every victory, every opinion. After awakening, sincerity remains, but seriousness fades. Life becomes lighter, even in pain. This shift is often misunderstood. To those still entangled in the drama, the awakened may seem indifferent, detached, or cold. But indifference is not what they feel, it's spaciousness. They have realized that joy and sorrow are two notes of the same song, and to cling to either is to miss the music itself. There's a quiet beauty in this freedom. The awakened no longer strive to be good, or holy or right. They simply are. They've seen that morality, though useful, is another construct, a map, not the territory. Watts explained that true virtue arises naturally when one is in harmony with life. You don't need commandments to tell water how to flow. It simply follows the path of least resistance. Likewise, when awareness is unclouded, kindness and wisdom arise without effort. But to the unawakened, this effortless state appears strange, even suspicious, because we live in a world addicted to striving. And so, the awakened suffer silently not because they reject the world, but because they see its madness too clearly. They see people chasing illusions, wealth, fame, validation, and feel compassion, not judgment. They know the pain of that chase, for they too once ran. But they also understand that every soul must tire of the game in its own time. No one wakes up because they are told to. They wake up because the dream becomes unbearable. Watts captured this with haunting simplicity. When you get the message, you hang up the phone. Still, the awakened do not isolate completely. They continue to love, to create, to laugh, but from a different place. Their love is not need, it is overflow. Their laughter is not mockery, it is reverence. They find joy in the simplest things, the sound of rain, the rhythm of breathing, the sight of someone discovering beauty for the first time. The ordinary becomes sacred again, not because it changes, but because they finally see it without the lens of longing. In this way, the silence that once felt like suffering transforms into a sanctuary. The awakened learn that silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of truth. And in that truth, they no longer need to speak. Their very being becomes the message. They walk through the noise of the world as still water, reflecting everything, grasping nothing. The world may never understand them, but for the first time, they no longer need to be understood. The more the awakened observe, the more they realize how the world thrives on resistance. Every system, every institution, every individual ambition depends on the illusion of control, the belief that life can be managed, owned, or fixed. Alan Watts warned that this obsession with control is precisely what keeps humanity in perpetual anxiety. The awakened, having seen through the illusion, find themselves torn between compassion and futility. They wish to ease others' suffering, yet they know that interference often strengthens the very illusion it seeks to dissolve. And so they choose silence, not out of indifference, but wisdom. They let life teach in its own mysterious way. This silence becomes a discipline, an art form. It's not about muting oneself. It's about listening so deeply that the boundaries between self and world blur. Watts spoke often of the music of existence, how every breath, every movement, every fleeting moment plays its part in the cosmic symphony. The awakened learn to hear that music again. They stop trying to conduct the orchestra and start swaying with the rhythm instead. In doing so, their suffering shifts from resistance to resonance. They begin to feel aligned with the unfolding of everything, even chaos. Yet, the paradox remains. Awareness sharpens perception, and with it, the ability to feel. The awakened don't suffer less. They suffer more consciously. They sense the pain of others as their own, the ache of the earth, the cries of forgotten souls, the loneliness behind every mask. Watts called this the price of consciousness, the burden of sensitivity. But he also hinted at the beauty hidden within it. When one suffers consciously, that suffering becomes luminous. It's no longer a wound, it's an opening. Through that opening, compassion flows freely, silently, endlessly. Still, the human part of the awakened struggles. They wake each day between two realities, one bound by time and duty, another infinite and formless. They pay bills, attend meetings, hold conversations, all while knowing that the person doing these things is a temporary ripple on an endless sea. The absurdity of it all can feel overwhelming. But Watts taught that humor is the antidote. Life, he said, is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be enjoyed. The awakened eventually begin to laugh again, not out of mockery, but understanding. Their laughter is gentle, knowing, filled with the relief of acceptance. And in that laughter, the silence breathes again, no longer heavy, no longer mournful. It becomes alive, playful, cosmic. The suffering that once weighed upon them now dances lightly at their feet. They begin to see that even silence has rhythm, even emptiness has form. The awakened finally realize to suffer in silence is not to be alone in pain, but to become one with the heartbeat of existence itself. As the awakened grow comfortable in their silence, something profound begins to occur. Life starts to live through them, rather than being lived by them. Alan Watts often described this as the effortless effort, where the distinction between doer and deed dissolves. The awakened no longer push against reality. They flow with it. Decisions are made not through calculation, but intuition. Words arise without rehearsal. Love happens without agenda. It is as though existence itself has taken the wheel, and the illusion of control, once a source of constant tension, finally releases its grip. This surrender is the quiet miracle of awakening. It doesn't grant supernatural powers or visions of light. It grants ease. The kind of ease that comes when you stop swimming upstream. The awakened no longer fear uncertainty, for they see that uncertainty is the only constant. Watts compared it to dancing on the edge of a cliff. The beauty lies in the balance, not the destination. The awakened learn to trust the unknown, to rest in the freefall, to find serenity in the absence of ground. What once terrified them now feels like freedom. However, this freedom carries weight. To live without clinging also means to love without possession. Relationships, once built on attachment and expectation, transform into spaces of mutual being. The awakened love deeply, yet they hold nothing. They don't demand permanence, they honor presence. And while this love is pure, it can be painful. Others may mistake their calm for coldness, their independence for disinterest. But as Watts said, the only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. The awakened continue to dance, even when no one hears the music. Gradually, the suffering that once defined their silence becomes something else: reverence. They begin to see that every tear was necessary, every ache sacred. Without the dark night, they would never have learned to see the stars within. What's often emphasized that contrast is essential. There is no sound without silence, no light without shadow, no joy without grief. The awakened no longer seek to erase pain, but to embrace it as part of the cosmic design. The more they surrender to it, the more it transforms pain into peace, silence into song. By now, the awakened no longer question why they suffer. They understand that suffering was never the enemy. Resistance was. The silence that once echoed with loneliness now hums with presence. It's not the silence of absence, but the silence of totality, where everything exists, undivided. The awakened finally rest, not in escape from the world, but in the heart of it, where even suffering bows to the infinite rhythm of being. In the stillness that follows surrender, the awakened begin to notice something extraordinary. The world, once seen as external, now unfolds from within. Alan Watts often said, "You are the aperture through which the universe is looking at itself." The awakened start to feel this truth, not as poetry, but as lived experience. Every sound, every face, every touch becomes a mirror reflecting the same essence. There is no longer an observer separate from the observed. There is only seeing itself. This realization shatters the last fragments of isolation. What once felt like suffering in silence begins to feel like communion with everything that exists. But the paradox persists. The more connected they feel to all life, the lonelier they appear to those still asleep. The awakened speak less, for words can no longer contain the fullness of what they perceive. Language, once a bridge, now feels like a cage. How can one describe the infinite in sentences built for separation? And so they speak through presence instead. Their silence, once heavy, becomes a form of communication more profound than speech, a vibration, a frequency of peace that others can feel but not explain. Still, moments of grief arise. The awakened sometimes mourn the simplicity of ignorance, the comfort of believing in beginnings and endings, in success and failure, in me and you. Watts warned that enlightenment is not an escape from duality, but an understanding of it. To awaken is to stand in the tension between opposites without needing to resolve them. Pain and joy become twins, each illuminating the other. The awakened cry, laugh, and breathe all in the same breath, no longer rejecting one to keep the other. Over time, their perception of time itself begins to dissolve. They no longer see life as a straight line from birth to death, but as a vast unfolding, a single eternal moment wearing countless faces. The past and future lose their grip. What matters is not duration, but depth. Each second stretches into infinity, rich with awareness. Watts described this as the eternal now, where everything happens at once, and nothing truly begins or ends. To live here is to be free, not from life, but within it. The awakened then realize something subtle yet profound. The silence they once called suffering was never silence at all. It was the hum of existence, the same soundless pulse that holds galaxies together and keeps hearts beating. It was life speaking in its original language, the one beyond words. To hear it is to know peace, and to live it is to embody wisdom. In that recognition, suffering transforms completely, from burden to blessing, from wound to wonder. By now, the awakened have stopped searching for meaning, not because they've lost faith, but because they've found what cannot be lost. Alan Watts taught that the meaning of life is simply to be alive. It sounds almost too simple for the mind to accept, yet to the awakened, it's the most profound truth of all. They no longer chase purpose in the future or redemption in the past. They find in the texture of this very breath, in the sensation of being. What once seemed ordinary becomes divine. Washing dishes, walking through rain, or listening to the hum of a city at night, all become meditations on existence itself. This quiet revelation brings serenity. The awakened no longer wish to fix the world, for they see that the world was never broken. The suffering, the chaos, the longing, All are part of the grand movement of life, expressing itself through contrast. What's said, to define yourself is to limit yourself. Likewise, to define the universe as either good or evil is to misunderstand its play. The awakened understand this play, and so they participate in it with humility. They don't stand above the dream. They dance within it, knowing it's a dream. And yet, even in peace, a subtle ache remains, not of despair, but of love. A love so vast it hurts to contain. The awakened feel the pulse of all living things as their own heartbeat. They weep for strangers, for trees being cut, for oceans breathing, for laughter echoing through time. This is not sorrow, but empathy beyond form. Watts described it beautifully. When you realize that you live in an eternal now, you see that all suffering is your own. It's not a burden to carry. It's a responsibility to honor. Through this awareness, silence becomes sacred once more. It is no longer the silence of suppression, but the silence of understanding. The awakened no longer need to explain themselves to the world. They simply live fully, freely, quietly. Their very presence becomes a transmission of truth. People may not understand them, but they feel something when they are near, a calmness, a remembering, as if, for a moment, they too glimpse the stillness behind all motion. And so, the awakened continue their journey, not toward enlightenment, but within it. They walk through markets and mountains, through laughter and loss, knowing that everything is one continuous breath of the cosmos. They still suffer, but now their suffering sings. It hums the same melody that birthed stars and whispered through the voice of Alan Watts, that there is no separate self, no true silence, no final awakening, only the eternal unfolding of consciousness, forever aware of itself. In the deeper stages of awakening, something tender begins to bloom, a compassion so vast it feels almost unbearable. The awakened no longer see people as individuals trapped in chaos, but as waves of the same ocean, each rising and falling according to the rhythm of existence. Alan Watts once said that, "We do not come into this world, we come out of it," and the awakened feel this truth with every breath. They see that no one truly begins or ends, that every life is the universe exploring itself in a different shape. This recognition breaks the heart open, not in pain but in awe. The suffering in silence now becomes a sacred empathy. The awakened feel the heartbeat of others inside their own chest. The mother crying alone, the child lost in confusion, the stranger smiling through hidden grief. They see that all pain stems from separation, from believing the self to be something isolated. Watts often laughed at this grand illusion, calling it the skin-encapsulated ego, an idea so small it forgets it's made of stars. The awakened smile too, but their smile carries tears because they understand that love and loss are the same movement seen from different sides. Yet, this awareness doesn't make them immune to the world's weight. In fact, it makes them more sensitive than ever. The awakened still feel sadness, still experience fear, still confront uncertainty, but they no longer identify with it. Emotions rise and fall like weather in the mind, storms passing through a boundless sky. Watts compared this to watching clouds drift by. They do not belong to you, they simply pass. The awakened learn to witness life in this way, with soft eyes and an open heart. They stop demanding permanence from the impermanent, and in doing so, find peace amidst the chaos. Over time, this peace deepens into play. Life itself becomes a dance, spontaneous and unpredictable. The awakened laugh at their own seriousness, remembering Watts's gentle warning. Those who think they are enlightened are like people who got the joke and forgot to laugh. True awakening, they discover, isn't solemn or sacred, it's joyful. It's the freedom to laugh in the face of mystery, to embrace not knowing as a form of wisdom. The awakened don't escape life. They become more intimate with it. Every moment becomes a chance to marvel. And yet, through all of this, their silence remains. Not the silence of withdrawal, but of wonder. It is the silence that listens to the pulse of creation and whispers, yes. A silence that doesn't need answers because it has finally become one with the question. The awakened no longer seek to understand the universe. They let the universe understand itself through them. They have returned home, not to a place, but to presence. The awakened begin to live as the paradox itself, human and divine, limited yet infinite. Alan Watts often described this as the dance of opposites, the eternal interplay between what is and what seems to be. The awakened no longer attempt to resolve this dance. They embody it. They can feel sadness without drowning, joy without clinging, solitude without despair. They are at once the wave and the ocean, the dreamer and the dream. The suffering that once tormented them now feels like an echo, a faint reminder of the illusion that has dissolved. From this state, their silence becomes a gift to the world. Wherever they go, peace follows, not the peace of stillness, but the peace of acceptance. Watts used to remind his listeners that peace is not found by avoiding chaos, but by dancing with it. The awakened now live this truth effortlessly. They no longer divide life into sacred and mundane, light and dark. Every sound, every sensation, every experience is part of the same sacred totality. Even their suffering was never separate. It was the universe's way of learning to love itself. Sometimes, when they gaze at the world, a crowd moving, a river flowing, a sunset fading, tears fill their eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. They see themselves in everything, in the laughter of a child, in the decay of a leaf, in the distant hum of the city. What's called this the moment of cosmic consciousness, the realization that everything you touch is touching you back. To live this way is to be constantly reminded that there is no distance between observer and observed, between lover and beloved, between silence and song. And though the awakened rarely speak of it, there are moments when they feel a quiet gratitude for their suffering. They understand now that without the silence, they would never have heard the music. Without the emptiness, they would never have felt the fullness of being. The pain that once felt unbearable was, in truth, a teacher disguised in shadow. Watts used to say that to be alive is to feel, and the awakened finally grasped the totality of that truth, that to feel deeply, even sorrow, is to participate in the divine play of existence. In the end, the awakened do not escape life, nor transcend it. They meld into it, completely, joyfully, silently. Their suffering becomes light, their silence becomes song, and their existence becomes a reminder of what Watts tried to tell the world all along, that the awakened do not suffer because they are broken. They suffer in silence because they have remembered. They have remembered that they were never separate, never alone, and never meant to be anything other than the infinite consciousness, watching itself, loving itself, and endlessly becoming. Perhaps the greatest irony of awakening is that it does not end suffering. It transforms it. The pain that once felt personal becomes cosmic, and the silence that once felt lonely becomes infinite. Through every paradox, every surrender, every quiet tear, the awakened come to realize what Alan Watts always taught, that life is not something to overcome, but something to dance with. The awakened suffer, yes, but not as victims. They suffer as those who have touched eternity with their bare hands and discovered that it burns only because it is alive. Their suffering is not weakness. It is the soul's proof of awakening. And when that truth settles, something beautiful happens. The silence stops feeling like an exile and begins to feel like home. The awakened understand that they were never meant to escape the noise of the world, but to hear the silence within it. Every sound, every moment, every person becomes an echo of the same divine vibration. The universe was never something outside of them. It was always pulsing from within. Watts once said that you are the whole universe, pretending to be a person. And now, they finally understand. The silence was never absence. It was the voice of everything that is. This understanding does not erase their humanity. They still cry, laugh, love, and lose. But now they do so with a tenderness that feels almost divine. They see beauty even in imperfection, grace even in chaos. The awakened no longer chase light or run from shadow. They see both as sacred. Because to truly awaken is to see the divine in everything, even in pain, even in silence. And from that place, suffering becomes not a curse, but a kind of prayer, a reminder that to feel deeply is to be fully alive. So, if you find yourself suffering in silence, perhaps it is not a punishment, but an initiation. Maybe life is not breaking you apart, but breaking you open. As Alan once reminded us, the crack is where the light gets in. What feels like loss may be the beginning of sight. What feels like silence may be the universe teaching you to listen. You are not alone in your stillness. Every awakened soul walks this quiet path beside you, unseen, but deeply connected through the same eternal breath of being. And if these words have resonated with something inside you, that small, silent knowing, stay with it. Let it guide you. Share this message so that others may remember too. Leave your reflections below. Your story may be the echo someone else needs to hear tonight. And if you wish to walk further on this path of awakening, subscribe and join this circle of quiet understanding, where silence is not emptiness, but the sound of the universe remembering itself through you.